So, I've heard some criticisms and some misunderstandings revolving around some of your statements to the press about this monument is about compassion and unity and stuff like that. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the fact of the matter is, you have to understand that it's counterproductive for us to come out full guns blazing and say that we're, to use a reverse terminology, say we're endorsing evil or something, or that we're anti-morality or whatever else. It doesn't help to use that kind of language. I feel that I use a word like compassion. It's not entirely meaningless, but it does beg the question of what is meant, and it doesn't discount any notions of meritocracy or justice. Those are all in line. It's an idea of working for a greater good, but whose greater good, And at the very core of it, though, I do believe in working toward making the world a better place, as I see it, and as I think could benefit our demographic, the left-hand path followers, and make it a world more equitable for us. And to me, that's compassionate. It doesn't mean that handing out money to vagrants, or that I otherwise hold stupidity as a virtue, or any of those kinds of things. But it does mean that I'm willing to engage in the social political dialogue in such a way that I will be taken seriously. That I'm not always going to be wearing horns on my head if I go on do an interview on Al Jazeera TV or anything like that. And people are going to have to ask more pointed questions of me to get down to the philosophical core of what I'm really talking about, because they're not going to be able to just discount me for using a different type of terminology that they would expect, and frankly they would like to hear me use. I'm sure the detractors, those trying to marginalize me, would love it if I came out with some kind of middle school rhetoric about initiating a bloodbath and provoking all-out warfare and that kind of idiotic rhetoric that's not going to get us anywhere at all. I'm demanding to be taken seriously.
Yeah, no, I totally get that, and that's kind of something similar to the response that I was predicting. But I mean, as you're well aware of being a Satanist, you get pigeonholed in these types of expectations, and you're supposed to be about immorality and evil and hurt and pain and suffering, and that's kind of what people are expecting you to say. So that's interesting. That also brings up.
Well, then, yeah, what I'm saying is, I can't say we're against morality. However, what I mean by that is they'll cut it off right there. In fact, you have to say, as Anton LaVey even said at one point, we're a moral people. And then it forces them to ask you to define it from there. I say we promote compassion. Well, they're going to have to understand what that means. They're going to have to dig deeper, but they can't just dismiss me wholesale from there.
Now, isn't it true that you were pretty proactive in the late 80s, early 90s in the satanic ritual abuse, paranoia, the satanic panic?
Well, that's kind of before my time to actually be involved, but the satanic panic still carries on now, and I've been very active in fighting that for the past many years. You can see my articles mostly on process.org, where I've written about different psychotherapists who still use regression therapy or still endorse these ideas to treat multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder. And I don't know if most people who will be watching this are aware, but this is really where these bizarre notions of a satanic cult conspiracy took root in the 80s and 90s and caused this kind of full-on panic and witch hunt, and kind of created a lot of the ideas people still have about Satanists. Simple blood libel accusations, the cannibalism, the breeding babies for sacrifice, and that kind of thing. this kind of slander that's gone on to any minority outgroup for a long time. It was said of Native Americans in early America. It was said of the Negro slaves. It was said of Jews before them. It was said of pagans by the Christians. It was said of Christians by pagans when Christians were a minority, and so on back down the line. But one thing I have fought for quite a bit before even being involved in the Satanic Temple at all was getting people to realize that the Satanic Panic never really ended. It ended technically when the media stopped paying attention to these people, but there's still this whole kind of bizarre psychotherapeutic subset that feeds these delusions to the mentally vulnerable who come into their care. And that's something I really wanted to take up the fight against with the Satanic Temple, and haven't really devised a means to do that yet. But one of the primary organizations for putting forward this bullshit is known as the ISSTD, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, which puts itself out as this professional psychotherapeutic organization for professionals, and claims to be science-based, but it's all based on this debunked pseudoscience. And they still do annual conferences where they'll talk about things like ritual abuse, which was formerly known as satanic ritual abuse. They've tried to shield themselves from being so open about the conspiracy theory aspects of what they're doing, but it still goes on, and I feel that should be a primary issue for the self-identified Satanist, whatever group you belong to.
Yeah, it's a little bit, the satanic ritual abuse and the satanic panic was before my time as well, but it's interesting. I think it's going to come in waves. I think it's going to come and go. It seems like for a while it was on its downtime, but maybe it's coming back, and maybe it will never actually fully fade out.
Well, there was a new book that came out. It was called 22 Faces, and I have to give myself credit because I debunked that book immediately, and it was getting press off the get-go, and uncritical press too. I don't know if you're aware of the book that's generally credited with kicking off the Satanic Panic, but it was called Michelle Remembers, and it was written by this Catholic therapist whose Catholic patient had come in, and they had developed this very bizarre, confabulated, obviously Catholic story of satanic abuse, which was obviously fiction, so obviously fiction that it's just amazing that this book got the kind of press it did. It was promoted in People Weekly, which is one of the worst shit rags ever. They've been Satanic Panic purveyors for some time, and in other mainstream outlets, and the authors on Oprah and those kinds of shows. But it's a supernatural horror story where this woman's supposed to have recovered these memories where she was abused by Satan himself, and is also visited by the Virgin Mary and Jesus and the Archangel Michael, and they remove her scars, and this takes away corroborating evidence that any of this happened to her. So the fact that this story had to be debunked on its mundane details is incredible. And then there was another book that gained I think an equal level of publicity, and was taken as a credible story of recovered memories of abuse, and that was called Satan's Underground, and it was actually a Christian magazine called Cornerstone that went and debunked the mundane details of the claims the woman was making in that book about being abused by Satanists and having bred babies for sacrifice and everything else. Years later, the same magazine tracked her down after her book was debunked and it was pulled from publication, and found that she was claiming to be a Holocaust survivor, even though she wasn't Jewish. I don't think she'd ever been out of the United States. So, discredited as these books are, you still have this underground therapy scene that takes these as credible sources of information. And this woman in Utah, a con woman by the name of Judy Byington, wrote this book called 22 Faces, and it was supposed to be another story of satanic ritual abuse recovered through this memory process. And this is also a story where she's saved by divine intervention at some point in the book, and it also includes levitating Satanists, demonic possession, which is held separate from multiple personality disorder and all that. So all these supernatural elements that you would think wouldn't need to be debunked, that people could look at that and say, this is bullshit. And yet, to my horror, I found out that this woman was going to be on Dr. Phil. And the Dr. Phil show invited this author on to talk about this amazing story. And at this point, I had already written a review of the book for Skeptical Inquirer, but the magazines are slow to put out their content. It can take many months. And this Dr. Phil episode was going to air. Anyways, this can be seen on process.org, where I wrote an open letter to Dr. Phil after reaching out to his producer several times. So on examiner.com, I wanted to put a time-stamped open letter to Dr. Phil that would just point out to people that these are the facts, as Phil and his producers should have known them before they had her on. You know, that they couldn't claim that they didn't have this information. And the woman was, at this point, a proven con woman. She had claimed that she had worked with the Attorney General's office in Utah on a ritual abuse task force. An associate of mine contacted the Attorney General's office. They never heard of her, never had a working relationship with her whatsoever. She was being promoted as this woman's therapist. Turns out she hadn't been licensed as a therapist for at least 10 years or whatever. I think that's actually a felony. And there was some kind of investigation going on in Utah. I don't even know where that's at right now. But she had to backtrack on a lot of her claims. In any case, the Dr. Phil show was supposed to air Halloween that year, and it got pushed back to some point in January, and then they ended up running a not-so-flattering piece that apparently was parsed down from several hours. But anyways, my whole point there is that they're still pushing for it, and it took a small group of us to really hammer on this right away to stem the tide of media she was getting, because the media was on the rise with this. And all the stories you would see, they weren't discussing the fact that the story was so incredible and implausible. They weren't talking about the fact, the supernatural elements at all. It would be presented as though this is a true-to-life story of this woman's condition, you know, this multiple personality disorder, this dissociative identity disorder, and that this can be taken as some kind of fact. And it has, of course, these ISSTD authorities who have written a foreword and blurbs on the book itself. So you have people being kind of indoctrinated into this idiotic idea. And I think you're right, it can come back if you let that happen. And I feel like part of our job should be to see that this doesn't happen. I feel like 22 Faces could have gained a lot more traction if we hadn't nipped it in the bud. And I feel it's counterproductive for the satanic organization to sit back and just watch this kind of thing happen. You need to speak out, you need to do something, you need to discredit these people, and they need to fear you for those reasons. Those are the right reasons.
Do you have any thoughts on Do you have any thoughts on Bob Larson?
Oh yeah, Bob Larson.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I have to say, if somebody was going to say that they were considering either doing an exorcism or going to somebody from the ISSTD because they suspected they had multiple personality disorder, they weren't sure between demonic possession, multiple personality disorder, I would tell them getting an exorcism is far more benign than going into therapy for multiple personality disorder. Because if you go into an exorcism, you can have this cathartic event where you spit up a bit, you swear, you blaspheme, you maybe whip out your junk and have a good